in which many contemporary socialists and anarchists indulge are, in spite of their impracticality and non-adaptation to present environmental conditions, analogous to the saints' belief in an existent kingdom of heaven. They help to break the edge of the general reign of hardness and are slow leavens of a better order. The next topic in order is asceticism, which I fancy you are all ready to consider without argument a virtue liable to extravagance and excess. The optimism and refinement of the modern imagination has, as I have already said elsewhere, changed the attitude of the Church towards corporeal mortification, and a Suso or a Saint Peter of Alcantara appear to us today rather in the light of tragic mountebanks than of sane men inspiring us with respect. Footnote: Saint Peter, Saint Teresa tells us in her autobiography, quote, has passed 40 years without ever sleeping more than an hour and a half a day. Of all his mortifications, this was the one that had cost him the most. To compass it, he kept always on his knees or on his feet. The little sleep he allowed nature to take was snatched in a sitting posture, his head leaning against a piece of wood fixed in the wall. Even had he wished to lie down, it would have been impossible, because his cell was only 4 feet and a half long. In the course of all these years, he never raised his hood, no matter what the ardor of the sun or the rain's strength. He never put on a shoe. He wore a garment of coarse sackcloth, with nothing else upon his skin. The garment was as scant as possible, and over it a little cloak of the same stuff. When the cold was great, he took off the cloak, and opened for a while the door and little window of his cell. Then he closed them and resumed the mantle, this way, as he told us, of warming himself and making his body feel a better temperature. It was a frequent thing with him to eat once only in 3 days, and when I expressed my surprise, he said that it was very easy if one once had acquired the habit. One of his companions has assured me that he has gone sometimes 8 days without food. His poverty was extreme, and his mortification, even in his youth, was such that he told me he had passed 3 years in a house of his order without knowing any of the monks otherwise than by the sound of their voice, for he never raised his eyes, and only found his way about by following the others. He showed this same modesty on public highways. He spent many years without ever laying eyes upon a woman, but he confessed to me that at the age he had reached, it was indifferent to him whether he laid eyes on them or not. He was very old when I first came to know him, and his body so attenuated that it seemed formed of nothing so much as of so many roots of trees. With all this sanctity, he was very affable. He never spoke unless he was questioned, but his intellectual high-mindedness and grace gave to all his words an irresistible charm. Close quote. End footnote. If the inner dispositions are right, we ask, what need of all this torment, this violation of the outer nature? It keeps the outer nature too important. Anyone who is genuinely emaciated from the flesh will look on pleasures and pains, abundance and privation, as alike irrelevant and indifferent. He can engage in actions and experience enjoyments without fear of corruption or enslavement. As the Bhagavad Gita says, only those need renounce worldly actions who are still inwardly attached thereto. If one be really unattached to the fruits of action, one may mix in the world with equanimity. I quoted in a former lecture St. Augustine's antinomian saying, "If you only love God enough, you may safely follow all your inclinations." He needs no devotional practices whose heart is moved to tears at the mere mention of the name of Hari, is one of Ramakrishna's maxims. And the Buddha, in pointing out what he called the middle way to his disciples, told them to abstain from both extremes, excessive mortification being as unreal and unworthy as mere desire and pleasure, The only perfect life, he said, was that of inner wisdom, which makes one thing as indifferent to us as another, and thus leads to rest, to peace, and to nirvana. We find, accordingly, that as ascetic saints have grown older and directors of conscience more experienced, they usually have shown a tendency to lay less stress on special bodily mortifications. Catholic teachers have always professed the rule that, since health is needed for efficiency in God's service, health must not be sacrificed to mortification. The general optimism and healthy-mindedness of liberal Protestant circles today makes mortification for mortification's sake repugnant to us. We can no longer sympathize with cruel deities, and the notion that God can take delight in the spectacle of sufferings self-inflicted in his honor is abhorrent. In consequence of all these motives you probably are disposed, unless some special utility can be shown in some individual's discipline, to treat the general tendency to asceticism as pathological. Yet I believe that a more careful consideration of the whole matter, distinguishing between the general good intention of asceticism and the uselessness of some of the particular acts of which it may be guilty, ought to rehabilitate it in our esteem. For in its spiritual meaning, asceticism stands for nothing less than for the essence of the twice-born philosophy. It symbolizes, lamely enough no doubt, but sincerely, the belief that there is an element of real wrongness in this world, which is neither to be ignored nor evaded, but which must be squarely met and overcome by an appeal to the soul's heroic resources, and neutralized and cleansed away by suffering. As against this view, the ultra-optimistic form of the once-born philosophy thinks we may treat evil by the method of ignoring. Let a man who, by fortunate health and circumstances, escapes the suffering of any great amount of evil in his own person, also close his eyes to it as it exists in the wider universe outside his private experience, and he will be quit of it altogether, and can sail through life happily on a healthy-minded basis. But we saw in our lectures on melancholy how precarious this attempt necessarily is. Moreover, it is but for the individual, and leaves the evil outside of him, unredeemed and unprovided for in his philosophy. No such attempt can be a general solution of the problem, and to minds of somber tinge, who naturally feel life as a tragic mystery, such optimism is a shallow dodge or mean evasion. It accepts, in lieu of a real deliverance, what is a lucky personal accident merely, a cranny to escape by. It leaves the general world unhelped and still in the clutch of Satan. The real deliverance, twice-born folk insist, must be of universal application. Pain and wrong and death must be fairly met and overcome in higher excitement, or else their sting remains essentially unbroken. If one has ever taken the fact of the prevalence of tragic death in this world's history fairly into his mind, freezing, drowning, entombment alive, wild beasts, worse men and hideous diseases, he can with difficulty, it seems to me, continue his own career of worldly prosperity, without suspecting that he may all the while not be really inside the game, that he may lack the great initiation. Well, this is exactly what asceticism thinks, and it voluntarily takes the initiation. Life is neither farce nor genteel comedy, it says, but something we must sit at in mourning garments, hoping its bitter taste will purge us of our folly. The wild and the heroic are indeed such rooted parts of it, that healthy-mindedness, pure and simple, with its sentimental optimism, can hardly be regarded by any thinking man as a serious solution. Phrases of neatness, coziness, and comfort can never be an answer to the Sphinx's riddle. In these remarks, I am leaning only upon mankind's common instinct for reality, which in point of fact has always held the world to be essentially a theater for heroism.